community folks, particularly folks who are really interested in social justice, which I find is most of us, folks in and out of the academy, the way in which writing or composing or voice really matters. And there's this sweet spot. What we often see in the academy, which was, the really great keynote that said all sorts of interesting things, but said it in a way that was inaccessible to most audiences. There is a way that folks in the academy are trained to speak and are encouraged to speak and are often forced to speak. A voice that people may not necessarily choose to speak. And then there is a way that community folks speak, the way that everyday folks speak, that is often not taken seriously but has a lot of value and has a lot of expertise. And I think one of the really exciting things that I've seen in my work with folks at Ohio State and other universities is that sweet spot between where we can bring voice forward, we can help people compose and write and do it in a language that's authentic and is really their voice, but present it in a way that gives it a visibility that's different than it might have on its own, than it has on the front porch at the corner of 4th and 8th. I think one of the things that folks from the academy really have to offer is, just by engaging, is often an ability to bring credibility to the expertise and the knowledge that everyday folk have. One of the ways that's manifested in the organization that I work with and the folks that I work with is through a project that we call Community Future Casting. And in that project, we have cameras and microphones and lights and software to do video editing, and we help people tell the stories of things, predict futures that they would like to see happen. So they tell the story of a place, and that place could be a 10 by 4 block square area. It could be a building, it could be a tree, it could be an intersection. They tell the story of a place. And then they predict a future that they would like to see happen in that place. And one of the things that we found is the medium, giving people an opportunity to speak through the medium of video makes a difference. So somebody could speak in their regular, ordinary voice to a city council member about something they really care about, and may or may not be heard well, but you put that same voice on a video, and suddenly people hear it differently. The medium matters. And so that's one way that we've really seen helping people share their voice. Now, one of the things that we felt very strongly about in this project is that the folk who are speaking retain editing control. And so when they're filmed, they get to review how that gets edited. Our preference is actually that they do the editing themselves with whatever level of assistance they need. But if they choose not to do that, they get to review and make sure that they're being presented in exactly the way they want to be presented, and that they're presented authentically. That's one example of the ways in which community voices and folks from the academy can come together and really work together to help community members speak in a way that's for the good of that community. One of the questions that we've been asked to answer, what suggestions do we have from the community about how colleges and universities can encourage students to engage in a meaningful community writing and composing? The first thing that has to come with that is for folk to be honest with what they have to offer and what their expectations are. I know that, again, going back to the keynote, the marketed, the administered, the institutional, and the vernacular genre, like I'm talking a lot about the vernacular genre here, but it's really important to understand that being able to speak in an institutional voice, being able to speak in a way that serves complex relationships is really important, and helping people understand what it means to speak in a voice that folks that will speak to that audience. But also to really, I think the thing that if you leave with one understanding from what I have to say today, it's some honest reflection about the administered genre and the ways in which many of us in various institutions, and now I'm speaking specifically about the academy, that genre, one of the things she said there was that genre, that voice is about what suits those in power, like thinking about how to speak in a way that suits those in power, and oftentimes, whatever institutions we're enmeshed in, it's really hard to it's really easy to internalize that and to internalize that unawarely. So when you're interacting with community people, what I would ask of you is to think about the ways in which you habitually speak in a voice that you're unaware that you're speaking in. It may not even be a voice that you've chosen to speak in, but it's a voice that you have gotten into a habit of speaking in because you've needed to survive in the institution. And not just the voice, but the attitudes that come with that voice. God, as early as 3rd grade, we know that it's cool to hang out with the 4th graders and not so much with the 2nd graders. And certainly, when I think about the wonderful, incredible people I know at Ohio State University, everybody is clear about the class differences between students, staff, and faculty. Like whether we want to say that or not, we're clear about what that is and what that means. So then you add community to that, and I think oftentimes, unless we're really aware of the way in which we've been forced to internalize those class differences, that unawarely gets brought to our relationships with community people. And so it's important that you have done some internal reflection on that, and particularly if you're sending your students out to work with the community, that you help them do some really honest reflection about how it's cool to hang out with the 4th graders and not so much with the 2nd graders. And these are college students or undergrads or graduate students who now get to go out and be with the experts and communities and really learn some things. And they're going to take unawarely those attitudes about how much they know and how much the folks they're interacting with don't know. And that really gets in the way of doing the great social justice work that all of us want to do. It just gets in the way. And the way to get it out of the way is to think awarely about it. So that's the biggest piece of advice I have. And the part that I'm most excited about in this session is the place where we all get to talk to each other.
I am Jackie Calderon, and I'm the director of the Youth Arts Program of Transit Arts. We're located over on the Near East Side. One of our fabulous young artists and also administrators, Kat Hurst, is here with me. And so hopefully you'll get to ask her some questions later too, because she's also a writer. I want to pass one thing out to you because it's been an interesting tool for communicating and getting people. This was created by a young person when we were located over at Livingston, on Livingston Avenue over between Ohio and Champion. And it was a pretty tough spot over there. A lot of shootings, unfortunately, a lot of crazy stuff going on. When we opened up our facility, there was a functioning crack house next door that nobody seemed concerned about until we had our special event with some city officials and board members, and all of a sudden the crack house got closed down. So that was interesting. But it was a good thing for the little girl that lived right next to it. But the creative dream, the CD of your life, was created by a young man, Ricky Brown. We were having a conversation about perceptions of inner city young people, especially young black men. And he said that he was so frustrated because people never even dreamed, in his experience, that his great love and interest at that time was to be an archaeologist. He said, people just look at me and they think I want to play basketball, I want to rap, and those are all great things, but that's not my passion. And so when I say archaeology, they look at me like, huh? this doesn't compute. And it really touched me because he was talking about, he said, I always want to go out just out in the streets and talk to these guys that are sitting on their front porches and drinking 40 ounces in the middle of the day, and to say, is this what you dreamed of becoming when you were a little kid? Is this what you thought you were going to do? Was this your great dream? And it really tied into the digging piece, because he talked about how the layers of stuff just kept piled up on that original dream. Mm. And it's so difficult at a certain point to uncover all that stuff and realize who your core, what's at the core. And so as a group, we would have these things called dine-in discussions, which would be a way to sit around the table and share food and tell stories and learn about different cultures, and then write about the stories in some cases. Sometimes it would be more a video. We would always videotape, which was really powerful. Sometimes it was just the oral storytelling, and sometimes writing. But they suggested that we have this written paper because we found, especially with young people, and actually more often than I thought with older people, that when you ask these same questions and ask people to answer them out loud, you get very different responses than when you take someone through the process and invite them to just write their answers privately. So things like the very first question, when you were a little kid, what did you dream about becoming when you grew up? And you see, when you're talking about the language that you use, we use the language that the kids came up with. So it's not all perfect, but it was the language that they felt most comfortable, was more conversational. So we found that really did make a difference in how people answered these questions, which is really interesting. So things like, when you were a little kid, what did you enjoy doing so much that you completely forgot at the time? Sleeping doesn't count, watching TV doesn't count. But we would take the kids through this process and ask them to actually just sit with this and think about these answers, and then just write it in any way that they felt comfortable with. So again, going through this process of softening people who are responding. So asking, name someone who's been a hero to you. And you might say, what does this have to do with your dream? But it would put the young person or the older person into a more reflective place. And so often we would get answers like, my grandmother or my mom or my dad or my uncle or whoever, or someone who's passed, Dr. King, Gandhi. But excuse me, again, it would just sort of shift the thinking. And then this, again, going down to the bottom, just thinking about, imagine you had everything you needed. You didn't have to worry about food. You didn't have to worry about paying your rent. You didn't have to worry about how you were going to get somewhere when it's, the chill factor is 10 below. Everything is taken care of. What could you imagine yourself doing? Somehow make the world a better place. It doesn't have to be Mother Teresa. It doesn't have to be a huge scale, but just in some way you're making a contribution. So again, it's that process of softening. So by the time we would turn it over and ask them, what creative things do you like to do? The same kids who often would just say, first of all, wouldn't even respond to this in an outward voice, when they could just check off the boxes. We found out that, and I did this even up at the Scioto Juvenile Facility for kids who had committed violent crimes, and people were saying, you're going to do a dream questionnaire with these kids? Are you kidding? You're going to draw trees and write journals? But it was really fascinating to see how many artists are in prison, which is a whole other story. But all these creative voices started to come out, and they were talking about gardening with their grandparents or cooking. There are a lot of things that were attached to memories. And so again, it's just such a beautiful way of starting to engage people in that process of writing about who they are at the core. which then allows them to start having that conversation with other people. So again, not to go through this whole thing, but I just wanted to share this with you. The other thing that we found that was really, really important was to put a gold sticker on this. We did it without the gold sticker, we did it with the gold sticker. When we would put this down in front of the kids with a gold sticker, we would have to stop them from filling it out before we took them through the process. When it was a plain sheet, they just sort of looked at it like, oh, here's another test. So it's very interesting, just those little weird things that you can do to open that dialogue. So anyways, I just wanted to share that first, given what you were just talking about. And I'm not so technologically great, but I just wanted to take you through some images of what we do. We do another great way that we've been able to engage the community in storytelling is through open mic performances. So we have a performance group that goes out throughout the community, wonderful artists, a mix of dancers and poets and singers and rappers and freestyle artists. But we'll do performances and then we almost always open it up into an open mic. And so we do a frequent series of open mics where young people can come, share their words with each other through the oral tradition, and then they can write them, so we'll publish their works and things like that. But then we, some of our artists were influenced by the words and started doing live paintings at the open mic. So the right side was done by a youth artist and the left side was done by a professional artist, a mentoring artist. And so that became one of our traditions, to be able to, again, reflect the stories through these paintings. So there's obviously so many different ways to tell stories. This I thought was interesting. This artist, Jay Carey, who used to be a kid in the program, who's now a professional artist and mentors many of our young people. And just that whole sense of how you're perceived, how you're reflected by the people you meet. And so it's something that we have to really keep in our minds, is what kind of mirrors are we to the people that we're engaging and wanting to hear their stories. How are we seeing them, and how are they seeing themselves in our eyes? Because a lot of times, again, we work a lot of our participants are young black men, but any kid, that natural sense of caution, a defensiveness, in many cases a process of putting up a wall, because you're going to hate them first before they hate you, because you don't want to be that vulnerable, and because there, so many times our young men are just walking down the street and people are locking their cars and they're just trying to go to school. This young artist, well, he's not so young anymore, but this, again, you see they were at the Columbus Arts Festival and they were doing the live painting, but he is an amazing, his name is Lyric, and he does freestyle poetry and writing, but he was one of the, and dancing, he's multi-talented, and he's an amazing barber, and he just moved out of Whiteland Park, but he, when we did our first open mics at the Short Stop in the Short North, he was one of the kids that was involved. It was really fun because, again, at that time we didn't censor. Well, I mean, we don't censor, but kids could just come up and say whatever they wanted. They'd have rap battles, and sometimes they get pretty crazy. Well, they wanted to start bringing their families. It was really amazing how they were so proud of what they were writing, and here are all these kids who normally wouldn't carry books around because it was a sign of weakness. Well, because they would have contests, they'd start going in the back of the room with a thesaurus and the dictionary and trying to come up with the most creative battle rap, and we would put out challenges to say, okay, everybody can say the F word, but can you come up with something more creative? What are some other possibilities? We'd make contests around that. And then they ended up becoming really excited about finding new ways to express themselves, and then they decided that they wanted the content of their material to be accessible to their little brothers and sisters and cousins and grandparents. So they self-censored, I suppose, to say, you know what, we want to keep this in a place that everybody can experience this and we can get our message out. We want our message to be heard. And so if we're saying it in a way that turns people away, then we're not going to be heard. So I thought that was a really interesting lesson from the kids, you know, because I'm the big liberal, let everybody say whatever they want, but it was a really powerful message from them. Just some quick images of some of the kids involved. One of the young men who performed at ComFest about some of the bullying that was going on with kids who were gay. Oh, this kid, here we go. He cracks me up. The first time I met him, I said, what's your name? He said, Coltrane. I said, really? Wow, that's awesome. I said, do you know who John Coltrane is? And he said, well, of course. And he goes on and tells me the whole story. I said, okay, I knew that. So again, a young storyteller. Some of the amazing BHB doing the DJ thing. There was an open mic in the community. Moshe Clark, who's now a student at OSU, big reader. This kid, DeAndre, real quiet, and I don't want to say too much, but he has publicly said that his family went through some major challenges, and he just wasn't involved in anything. And he started writing, and it took months before he got up the courage after he kept attending open mics and seeing other people speaking, and he finally got up on his brother's birthday and read a poem, and he's never gone back since. I mean, he's never stepped backwards. He's just continued to. He's done live painting and performing, and it's been really exciting. But again, so many of the poems that the kids are writing are telling the stories of their lives or family members. Real quick, we did a project when you're talking about future casting. We worked with the neighborhood house, thinking about what their community might look like in 100 years. And so the kids did paintings and pastels and things like that. We did a photo shoot, and they created a video that talked about, they were interviewing each other like a TV show. So it was really cute. It was really empowering to see how they spoke when they got on camera. They would actually speak in that newscaster voice, you know. So here are kids who usually with each other talking street talk, and then they get behind the mic and they're oh so proper. It was very funny. But and then we did a professional photo shoot, and worked with Photoshop so they could create these images for their videos. So again, it was just the whole process of illustrating the story is really lovely. And the same group of kids, we did a photo shoot. They wanted to do a career night, and they did a fashion show, and so we went thrifting and got the ties and shirts because they didn't have. I think one kid had a shirt and a vest, but the vest wouldn't button. So we had a whole pile of stuff, and they were so excited about putting on these shirts and ties and being seen in a different light. And so there was a lot of storytelling that happened around that process. This Live in Peace, we did a whole initiative where we did the dine-in discussions with the kids, and we were talking about the violence that's going on in the neighborhoods. This is a summer and a half ago. And we're talking about the glorification of the rest in peace process. You know, when someone is killed a lot of times in gangs. I mean, it can be any situation. A grandma could die, you know, but it's there's always the thing that kids would line up to have their T-shirts airbrushed with the name "Rest in Peace" of the person who died. So the person who passed had more fame in death than they did in life, and so the kids wanted to shift that, and they came up with "Live in Peace," and they did in one of the discussions. I thought this was so brilliant. One of the kids decided that they wanted to do like the talking stick, but the talking stick was a football that had "Live in Peace" painted on it. And so there was something about holding that manly symbol that allowed our young people who would never do this to have tears streaming down their faces, telling stories about things that had happened in the community that they wanted to change. I thought that was really amazing, and again, another lesson from the kids. So just being able to find a way to maintain, keep face, but still be able to be vulnerable. And so, of course, it's our breakdance crew, and they've been wearing their Live in Peace shirts everywhere. This is, we did a mural project over on Champion, working with the kids at Champion Middle School, and you see their artwork all the way, all around the borders and behind, and then two of the kids who we photographed. But they're huge banners, like 4 by 8 feet, covering these boarded up windows on Champion. And again, this was a whole process of storytelling that they would talk about. You see a casket up there. This young man with the hoodie turning away, hiding away from the public view. But there were a lot of amazing stories that happened in this process. And then being able to see their work and their faces up on these boarded up buildings has been a really powerful piece for them, again, to be seen in this light of the sense of beauty, as opposed to so often what's happening in the media with, all the negative stories. Just a few other images. That's Lyric, the guy you saw who's the barber with his son. We got to meet Josh Groban, the famous singer. Did this really cool project with the OSU Design Program, a service learning project, which we're in the process of doing again this year, where kids actually get to come here. They've made avatars and do storytelling, and then they're building furniture for a new home. Some more process of storytelling through visual. But just to give you a sense of how we're engaging. And finally, we are doing a series of dine-in dialogues and a whole process with an art ed doctoral candidate at OSU, Kay Collins, who is leading these conversations every Wednesday at the Urban Art Space, and then we're doing some Saturday dine-in dialogues where we'll have kids to hopefully an 84-year-old woman coming together and sharing stories about their community and what we can do together to make change.
My name's Mindy Wright. I'm an assistant provost at Ohio State, where I work with a number of nonprofit organizations to connect them up through service learning, student interns, research. We've developed an undergraduate nonprofit studies program. In general, I try to help nonprofits who don't know anybody on campus navigate the university. Off campus, I'm a nonprofit volunteer, and then I serve on a number of boards and committees of a number of different organizations. Today, I think I'm here. Dickie can stand up and say, no, that's not right. Because of the intersection of those two sets of experiences. For the past 10 or so years, I've been teaching a writing in nonprofits course that pairs students with undergraduate students with local nonprofits to do writing projects that the organizations want done. So anybody who is at the last session in this room will see some connections with what I do with what was going on there. Okay, so I have a bunch of different partners for this class. They range from large nonprofits like the YWCA to really small nonprofits. Even though the Columbus Metropolitan Club has over 900 members, there's only 3 people on staff, except for this semester when I have a student working there, so there's 4 people on staff. I work across missions, so we have students who work with the Children's Hunger Alliance, Central Ohio Diabetes Association, with education, so folks that work at the Columbus Literacy Council at WOSU, Community Shelter Board, Columbus Coalition for the Homeless, around global international issues, Columbus Council on World Affairs. I also have a student who's working at technically not a nonprofit, but nonprofit like a city agency called the New Americans Initiative. And then also organizations that work around women's issues, so the Women's Fund, Institute on Women. So students in this class, even though they have one experience themselves with an organization, they get to learn from everybody else about the other organization. So hopefully they have a larger kind of perspective. So the kinds of writing that I work on with students and work on with my nonprofit writing partners are more institutional than the examples that you've heard before. So we work on kinds of writing that promote awareness. So things like newsletters, website content, social media, Facebook pages, Twitter, white papers, policy briefs. And when we're talking about this kind of writing, students not only need to learn the format of that, because these are fairly prescriptive in most situations, unlike the folks that Catherine and Jackie work with, where they're looking for people's own voices and their own personal expression. We're kind of trying to fit into a format here. And so students also then need to think about the variety of audiences. So Children's Hunger Alliance has an annual report that has an external audience that's a lot about funders. They want funders to see what good work they're doing. They may have an internal newsletter that's about kind of valuing volunteers, and so we have to think about those different audiences. We also do writing that helps raise funds, and that's something that all organizations need to do. So students may be doing the most direct kind of raising funds and grant proposals. They may be doing relationship nurturing writing, and this is the writing that quite often students in class at first see as kind of perfunctory. Thank you letters, donor solicitation letters, notes to a particular donor about something great that's happened in their lives, so that you're always nurturing those relationships. And then also what I'd call promotional stories, and this is where it crosses over with newsletters. A lot of my students talk to not just the people who work in the nonprofits, but the people who work with the nonprofits about their own stories, about how that particular organization has impacted their life in a positive way, and those are other ways that can kind of then be used in development strategies. So again, it's thinking about the audiences, thinking about the formats that are pretty strictly defined, but then also thinking about who's going to be reading those and what they want to know. And then, that's okay. Then the last area is kind of what I would talk about writing that promotes events or programs. So press releases around events, evaluations of programs, and again, different sets of audiences there. So when I think of the key thing about writing for and with community organizations, it has to do, the lens I see it because I'm a teacher, is through student transformation, is going from being a student, okay, who is there working with other students and who is valued and evaluated for their own perspective, okay? If everybody in class turns in the same paper, the teacher thinks something's not going right, okay? So, and quite often in humanities classes, those students are valued and evaluated for their own unique perspective in terms of how they interact with something. So they need to move from the student perspective to a more organizational nonprofit perspective, at least for this kind of writing. So if you look, this is kind of the typical picture that students quite often think of. The student alone in the library, there's a muse over their shoulder, they're coming to their own truth about whatever it is they're doing. They are getting evaluated for unique perspectives. It's even if they're working in a collaborative group, it's about what that group has kind of brought together to bring to the conversation. And when they go to work in a nonprofit, it often feels like I'm asking them to put on a mask. because they need to learn how to take on the voice of that organization. As I quite often say to them, we don't want to hear what you think about hunger in Central Ohio. I think it's good that you have opinions, but if you're writing for Children's Hunger Alliance, you need to be writing for that organization, and you need to sound like them, except in very particular instances. So they need to represent the group, they need to follow guidelines, and it needs to be mission-driven. Some students make this transition more quickly than others. Some of them make it more easily than others. But when I'm working with writing for community organizations, that's kind of my big overall goal, that I want them to see that change in role that they need to take on. The primary way I get them thinking about this, well, there's several ways. First of all, we have discussions in class. Second of all, they discuss with their community writing mentors all the time. They're learning from the folks that they're working with in the organizations every time they meet with them, every time they exchange writing with them. I also have an academic assignment that they do. And I ask them to do a rhetorical analysis of their organization. And they do this over a long period of time. We started class on June 9th. They will not turn in the final draft of this till the end of February, because they really need to learn about their organization in pretty detail to be able to sound like them. So they need to become familiar with the mission. They need to become familiar with the values of that organization. They need to figure out how it operates. The 3-person community Columbus Metropolitan Club doesn't have a lot of operating procedures. They're all kind of sitting in a space about this big, and they operate pretty informally. YWCA Columbus is not only a large organization here, but it's part of a large national organization. So they have lots of operating policies that they need to work through. They need to understand the different programs that the organization runs. They need to understand the stakeholders and the audiences, and that's what I was talking about before. They need to understand what kind of writing gets done there. If I think about the Columbus Literacy Council, which works to teach adults how to read and write, some of those adults are native speakers who for various reasons have not become the kinds of readers and writers that they want to become in their lives. Another large pool are immigrants who may know how to read and write in a lot of other languages, but that are learning how to read and write in English. Communicating to those audiences is not as easy as just writing something very clearly, okay? You need to think about that sometimes words and websites are not going to be the best way of communicating with that audience. Students also need to think about the rhetorical approach, and here, if you're familiar with the Children's Hunger Alliance, all of their materials and even their offices have huge pictures of bright, happy-faced children to show the impact of their work, okay? That's their rhetorical approach. That is very different from the commercials that we all see. I only see them when I wake up in the middle of the night. I'm sure they're on other times of the day. But that guy who's like in other countries who's showing you impoverished children and showing you their distended bellies and showing you the pain and the need that they have, okay? That's a different rhetorical approach. I'm not here to say that one is always better than the other, but just that they need to think about the rhetorical approach of Children's Hunger Alliance is not to show hungry kids. It's to show what happens when kids are well fed, okay? And then also language. One of the things that some of my students have really great opportunities to do, Community Shelter Board has a style guide, and the student who's working there can read through it all and say, this is how we write, this is the language we use, these are our kind of favorite words. If you think of an organization like the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, they are an organization that is not about direct service. It is about creating social change. So social change and words that mean social change are all over all of their materials. They also use the word empower a lot. And so they have a particular vocabulary that helps show their perspective, that if you're gonna write for and with the Women's Fund of Central Ohio, you better sure as heck be using words like empower and social change. So, because I kind of straddle the university and the community in terms of institutions, I do some writing for nonprofits, but then I'm also sharing that with my students. And it seems to me that when you're working on an institutional level, as opposed to a community organizing level, a key thing is to learn how that organization wants itself presented and to make that move to sound like that. And that takes practice. So that's kind of my story, and that's why I'm here.